Hi, Sean Kidney back again. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by my friend Martin Spolc, who is the head of the Sustainable Finance Unit of DG FISMA in the European Commission. DG FISMA is essentially the Ministry of Finance for our intents and purposes. And he's also been the architect of the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance that DG FISMA and the Commission has put out, Action Plan 1 and then version 2 that came out a little while ago. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. I want to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to talk to you about transitions. As you know, that's the theme of today's session. A transitions theme has been integrated into the EU Taxonomy, and you and I have been working together on taxonomy for years now, it seems like. But can you tell us more about what this actually means in practice now that we're getting to the regulation being out for European companies and investors?
Indeed, thank you very much, Sean. I think that we have really paid a lot of attention in the design of our regulatory framework and the enabling framework on sustainable finance, so that it is fitting and it's fit for purpose for supporting transition. And we have done several things together. I mean, also the technical expert group indeed has designed several concepts that ultimately have been integrated in the regulatory framework, and also the choice of the different sectors and activities that are covered by taxonomy. So just to give you an example, I mean, the taxonomy, the EU taxonomy as it currently stands, does not only cover the usual sectors that are already green and that are the renewables that, you know, is already non-problematic, but it obviously covers all the key important economic sectors where the transition challenges are the biggest and where also the potential to reduce emissions is the most significant. As a result,
so this is like buildings and industrial and so on, right?
Well, manufacturing, energy, transport, all these sectors are covered by taxonomy and really cover a large number of not only activities, but also ultimately the amount of emissions that our economy is producing. The second point that I would like to pass across is that we already have a concept inbuilt in the EU taxonomy framework, which doesn't recognize only low carbon activities, i.e. activities that are already green today and sustainable today, but it also recognizes activities that are very important for transition, but where they are not green today, but where they have to become greener tomorrow, and where the criteria have to be tightened over time to become ultimately aligned. And this is particularly the case of the sectors you mentioned, and this concept is enshrined in the EU framework. I have to admit that the conditions for recognizing these transitional activities are quite tough, but the concept is there, and we are making everything possible to recognize this concept and really make use of it as much as we can. And finally, I mean, you ask, I mean, what it means for businesses and for the financial sector. I think that the taxonomy has been designed as a kind of concept that can be used not only at a static, point in time, but in the first place, as a kind of dynamic tool to support everyone on their transition pathways. And here we talk not only about the financial sector, but also about the businesses. And here there have been many kind of claims that taxonomy, cannot be used by those who do not meet the criteria. Well, I cannot really emphasize more that it is actually the opposite. I mean, the taxonomy can be really used by anyone who wants. It can be a very useful tool for target setting. It can be a very useful tool for tracking progress. Even a company that doesn't generate a single euro or dollar, I mean, for taxonomy compliant activity, they can make a transition plan and have a clear vision of how their environmental performance will improve and the exposure to a taxonomy aligned activities will increase. So, I mean, we have really paid a lot of attention to all those aspects. I have to admit that there are some limitations, and there, I mean, we are obviously focusing now on improving how the taxonomy and the other frameworks can be better fit for purpose.
Limitations? Tell us more. How can there be limitations?
Well, I have to admit that, again, all our work that we have been doing obviously had to start somewhere. And so far, we have obviously paid a lot of attention and predominantly attention to the activities that are ultimately fully sustainable. And this is where our focus has been. But we did recognize throughout the process and also throughout the public consultations that we have run that we do need to pay even more attention to the intermediate steps that companies in the financial sector have to do on their transition. Here I would like to say that obviously the goals are clear and they should be the same for everyone. They are very ambitious and very challenging, but there are different pathways to get there. And while we already have the sustainable taxonomy, it is important to also recognize the interim steps and efforts of those who are making an effort towards these goals, yet not meeting the criteria. And here, I mean, we have identified that we have a certain gap in our framework, which we are trying hard to address. I don't know if you want to hear a little bit more about it, but
yeah, look, I think that tell us what you can. I mean, I appreciate you in the middle of negotiations and so on. So we don't want to complicate matters publicly, but you know, I'm conscious when it comes down to what we've got to do. There's this example I talk about in with the transport criteria, where in the TEG process we proposed a 50 gram per kilometre traveled threshold till 2025, and then it became zero carbon. And I remember having a conversation with a couple of investors about the implications of that. Let's say Volkswagen wanted to build a diesel plant outside of Duisburg, a new diesel car plant. It could reduce emissions by about 15% on the car fleet, which would be fantastic. But now that we know how much a portion of energy, 25% of all energy emissions are auto, and what the trajectory's got to be, actually it's not ambitious enough to meet our 2030 targets. So we need them to build electric rather than, and if they build a diesel plant, they're going to block the chance to build electric. So an improvement of 15% is not only not good enough, but it's counterproductive if it blocks the right kind of investment. And this is a concept. Now, of course, luckily, as we all know, Volkswagen is building electric plants, not diesel. So they're doing what Europe needs. But that understanding of minimum levels to achieve our targets is essential for this transitions idea, isn't it? That's what the buildings criteria is about. But it must be, you know, it's clearly hard in the industrial sectors and the manufacturing sectors to come up with thresholds like that. Is that what you mean by the more detail, or tell us more?
Well, in the first place, we are trying to use taxonomy in a way that would be easier to use by the businesses and the financial sector in a more dynamic way, so that you can use it as a tool also when the businesses communicate with the financial sector, how their environmental performance improve, basically how their proportion of their taxonomy aligned activities will increase over time. And also, even if a company doesn't meet the criteria 100%, it is already a progress when a company improves, let's say, the compliance with those criteria from, let's say, 20% to 80%. But the problem with the current framework, the issue that we have, the challenge, I would say, is that unless you really meet 100% of the whole criteria, which is obviously, you know, the full sustainability, which I think is really important to be clear on what is fully sustainable. The framework doesn't really fully recognize the interim steps that companies and the financial sector are making, especially from the significant harm area, where there is a transition from activities that are currently causing significant harm into the space where basically you don't kind of cause significant harm anymore, but you are not yet meeting the substantial contribution criteria.
Yep.
And we believe that these efforts should get recognition because these efforts are obviously necessary for meeting the goals, because obviously we are aware that the criteria are very strict, and they have to be strict because they have to comply with 1.5 scenario and all the targets. But I think we need to really have a more proper reflection, and that's also what, by the way, the platform has been working on. They have produced an excellent report earlier this year on these transition issues, and now the platform is also consulting on possible ways of how the taxonomy of sustainable activities can be extended to recognize also intermediate performance level. So we are looking at those issues with interest. I cannot obviously say today what the Commission will do, but what we will do is that we will bring some clarity on these issues already before the end of this year.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, we will submit a report basically on how we see the possible merits of extending the taxonomy framework to recognize this intermediate level of performance. And as we have presented in our latest strategy that we published in July, we will also look at different standards and labels that will be better suited to support the transition effort.
And by the way, for listeners, the report of the EU Platform on Sustainable Finance on sustainable, on significant harm, starts picking up some of these issues, which is out there at the moment for consultation. You can find it on the European Commission website, which is a discussion document led by Nancy Sach at the European Investment Bank. Great report. Other measures, you mentioned the action plan of sustainable finance. Tell us a little about other measures that will or could support this idea of transitions that you've done or you're looking at doing, just to give people a bit of specific color.
Well, one example that I would like to mention is the idea of the transition plans, which again, could be a very useful tool by both the businesses and the financial sector to articulate how the efforts will, evolve over time. Mm-hmm. And again, the taxonomy can be a very useful tool. Nobody imposes the taxonomy on anyone, but can be a very useful tool to have a conversation about how the environmental performance will improve over time. And I think that we need to have a discussion more with the industry and obviously with the supervisors and regulators, how through the disclosure framework, this kind of dynamic nature of transition can be better articulated and can be better used. I already mentioned the different standards and labels. I mean, so far, as you have seen, we are working on European Green Bond standard, which obviously requires a full 100% compliance with taxonomy activities that are sustainable. We are working on eco-label, which again would also allow retail investors and consumers to be more involved in this agenda. But we also need to recognize other possible or merits of possible other standards and labels that might be supporting the transition efforts. We are observing now what is happening in the market when it comes to the transition bonds or the sustainability linked bonds, which again, we believe might be very useful instruments, again, to support the financing of those who will not yet meet the criteria of the sustainable taxonomy 100%. So in the strategy that I mentioned, in the renewed sustainable finance strategy that the Commission presented in the beginning of July, we have basically committed as the Commission to work very closely with the sector. And again, this will be yet another example where the Commission will work in very close and strong partnership with both the financial sector and the businesses to explore whether there will be a merit in developing these standards for transition bond or sustainability linked bond or other possible labels together.
And I think that's interesting, isn't it? That you've talked a lot, Martin, in previous conversations we've had about the need for collaboration between the investment sector and the corporate sector in making this work, which is unusual because, often in European politics, member states, and I can remember a conversation with a member of the German government about 10 years ago when we were talking about green finance and why to mobilize green finance to get investors engaged. They were saying, we don't need to worry about getting investors engaged. If we want to do something, we just tell them. Things have changed, haven't they? Things have changed. There's a recognition now that collaboration is the key here. That's a sea change in thinking. Is this throughout the Commission? Is this, or is it just in your sustainable finance unit?
Oh, sure. Normally I'm a humble man, but I do have to admit that if there was one of the big successes of our agenda has been exactly this collaborative approach that we have basically pursued from the very beginning of this project. And we do believe that, of course, we do need to act as a regulator. And sometimes, obviously, there is a need for regulatory intervention to bring certainty and predictability and clarity to the market. By the way, the taxonomy is a clear case that the sector is asking for. I mean, this project has been initiated by the sector in the first place. But we obviously approach this agenda not only from the regulatory point of view, but from the kind of enabling point of view, how we can, as not only regulators but policymakers, can create the right environment for both the businesses and the financial sector, so they don't necessarily see this as a kind of threat only, especially the businesses who have kind of also now engaged in this agenda quite a lot, and that they see this as an opportunity. And that, we don't come only with yet another set of regulatory measures. And I think that if you read the latest agenda that we have presented in the renewed sustainable finance strategy, we really paid a lot of attention how to articulate the opportunities that the sector, both the financial sector and the businesses, have from this. And many of the actions that we have presented are really kind of calling for a lot of good and strong cooperation between the sector and the Commission, the regulators, the supervisors. We have the platform on sustainable finance, which I think is an excellent means how this cooperation can be articulated and actually implemented in practice. But the platform is 50 members. We do need to do much more, and several actions that we have presented in the strategy, which is, by the way, going far beyond the taxonomy. Inclusiveness, how to also, involve retail investors and citizens, the SME, all these require really a lot of in-depth discussion and cooperation between the Commission and the stakeholders.
It's pretty cool, but it's challenging, isn't it, to make all this work? I mean, don't get me wrong, I am so behind you on this. This is so critical to be able to have a collaborative atmosphere. We can't do this with public money. We need private money. We've got to make sure the private money can meet its objectives whilst also meeting our public policy objectives. If we're not talking and collaborating, it's not going to happen. Although, as you say, we do need intervention and regulation at a few critical junctures. And let's face it, the investors are asking for it. I mean, the investors we speak to is make a level playing field for us, they're saying. So that's what this is about. I'm just curious, though, while I'm trying about some stories, it has been challenging. I guess it still is challenging to keep this in line with the 2030 commitments. I say this because the 2030 commitments are pretty tough. I mean, as Commissioner McGuinness said in the interview we aired yesterday, these are really challenging commitments for Europe. 55% cuts by 2030. There's a lot to be done. You've got a tough balancing act here with the corporate sector, the industrial sector, having to, looking at really major changes, needing the support of the Commission. Where's that up to? How challenging it is? Do you think it's all going to be straightforward? Are we still going to be trying to wrestle with this problem still in 6 years' time because it's so challenging? Give us some hope, Martin.
I would love to give you hope. And I think that the hope is actually, enshrined already in our latest approach that we again presented in July, which I hope passes the right messages. And the messages are, look, we do understand that these goals are indeed very, very tough. And they are very challenging, not only for us as policymakers, because also we need to make sure that all our agenda is also politically acceptable, but ultimately for those who are working on the ground. And as a result of that, I hope that one of the key messages that we try to pass in our strategy is that we didn't turn the page and kind of forgot the previous action plan and, we came up with a new list of 10 actions, on which we think it would be good to work on. We have really recognized that we now need to, again, support stakeholders, financial sector and the businesses with the implementation of what we have launched back in 2017, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that, that we need to pay it a lot of attention to make sure that it works on the ground. So we have really taken, I think, in my view, a much more mature and kind of advanced way of thinking on how this agenda can, again, support stakeholders rather than threaten them and rather than, make additional stress in the system. The goals are very tough, but the way how we again, try to pursue our policy is that this policy should help the stakeholders who will need to transition anyway. I mean, it is not sustainable finance that tells the sector to transition. It is the ultimate goals and the European Green Deal, the target of achieving 2050 climate neutrality and obviously the 2030 climate targets. But we also have other targets with broader environmental objectives. And, it is not for the sustainable finance agenda to impose those targets. What the sustainable finance agenda can do, and we are really trying hard, is to provide the right toolbox, providing the right environment, providing the right, frame that that stakeholders ultimately see that if they do more of this together with us, they would have their life a bit easier.
Okay, so that's very much a work in progress issue. You're hinting at the fact it's tough, which of course it's got to be tough because we're dealing with something very, very hard here. And there will be a peu de frisson, if you like, across some of these issues as we go forward, but the intent is clear. And I guess that's the critical point about what Europe's doing at the moment, that the 2030 target is now enshrined in stone, backed by all the leadership, backed by the member states, even though I'm going to argue, this is my view, not the Commission's view, that most of the member states don't know how they're going to get there and what their contribution is, but we've started the work. And there will be, for my friends in the NGO community, a lot of arguments about how we get there, which is necessary. Because the problem is we haven't had those arguments in the past, and we should have. And we've got to this difficult stage now where the emissions reductions pathway is so tough, not to mention preparing our societies for adaptation. With the floods in Germany, we are aware now that climate change is live. It's actually happening. We've got work to do. But I want to go global because, of course, Europe's only 8% of global emissions. If we just fix things here, we do not fix the planet and Europe will suffer. So we've had some wins this year. Following on from Europe's 55% commitment, the ratification of that, we've actually had a whole lot of other countries, all the major economies of the world, now adopt pretty ambitious 2050 targets. The US, Japan, Korea, the UK, even China's got its 30-60 target, 60%, carbon neutrality by 2060. Mm. How in Europe do we support the concurrent transition amongst the world economies? How do we collaborate? How do we make this a global effort more successfully? We've got CBAMs on one side, which is, very interesting innovation supported by many people. But on the other side, on the positive side, there's two sides to that coin. What are your thoughts about that? What can you see happening?
I mean, Sean, the global dimension of our work has been always a priority, and especially at a time where there was not that much dynamism at the international level. Now, the good news is that it has changed, especially this year. I think that there has been really a major breakthrough now when also the G20 working group on sustainable finance has reconvened its work. I've been part of the
co-chaired by the US Treasury and the People's Bank of China, right?
Indeed, and I think that I've been really very encouraged by not only the ambition that the group now intends to pursue, but by the way, when we talk about transition, which is the topic of today, it has already popped up quite predominantly in the discussions, and many jurisdictions have raised the importance of discussing not only again the ultimate goals, the usual agenda that we have on which we have been working already until now, which is obviously the fully sustainable taxonomies, the European green bond standards, the disclosures, but ultimately also the transition and the frameworks and toolbox that can support transition. Obviously, this agenda is very important for emerging markets and developing countries. Here, I mean, we do need to pay attention that the goals, as you mentioned, I mean, are ambitious, to the extent possible, the same for everyone. But the pathways how to achieve those goals indeed might be different. But when it comes to the tools and the frameworks, our goal, at least in the European Union, is to converge on the toolbox, on the frameworks that we are developing, not only in Europe, but ultimately in China, in the US, how to support the stakeholders to reach those goals. And I think that, we already have, as you know, I mean, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which, by the way, continues to play an extremely important role in this G20 forum, because the IPSF is ultimately now in charge of basically producing all the intellectual and the technical work on how these tools can converge to the extent possible together. Now, the transition topic, which as I mentioned, I mean, has emerged quite recently, will, in my view, be really more and more prominent in the discussions, and I hope that this work team will really yield a lot of good stuff.
Martin, I have to share a little secret with you. In the H-League report, the High-Level Expert Group in Sustainable Finance, I shoved in that thing on the IPSF at the last minute and got everyone to agree to it. I'm very, very proud to see DG FSMA running of it and making it work so well globally. So okay, I've got a vested interest. I will accept.
I will stop claiming that it was my idea then.
No, many parents for one heaven. We all claim a piece of this pie, but I can just claim I got it in the report. That's my claim. But look, it's fantastic that work's going on. What we talked about yesterday in a session with your colleague Paulina from the Commission is the practical applications of how we can bring it. I mean, I suppose what we're thinking about at climate bonds is if we can get China, Europe, and the US basically lined up a common agenda, that's it. The world will follow. You know, we don't actually need to get 198 countries agreeing to anything here. We need to get the powerhouse economies of the world to agree. If the powerhouse economies of the world agree, when it comes down to either green finance measures or sustainable finance or industrial change, zero carbon steel, etc., and agree to work together on it, it'd be fantastic. And this morning in European time, I ran a session with on China green bonds, and we had a couple of important commentators there talking about the opportunity to collaborate on technology. They're saying China still has to get help with technology because large parts of it are not up to speed, collaboration, and then of course some green finance. So I think that's an exciting extension of this argument. So the G20 stuff is fantastic, right, that it's actually happening, and the RPSF. But Martin, I know you've got to go away and make all this happen. It's all very well talking to me.
You too, Sean. You too.
I appreciate you taking the time to do it. I guess I would just say, to leave the audience an idea of what to look forward to in the transition discussion. It's on the agenda. It's integrated into all the action plan of sustainable finance thinking. What sort of things should they look out for coming forward? What should the market be ready to hear about? Give us a bit of gossip, I'm trying to say. I know you can't say anything concrete, but just give us a bit of an idea.
I think that's one gossip. I don't think it's a gossip. I think it's basically what we already presented and said publicly is that we will continue working on taxonomy to make sure that it covers as many activities that are relevant for transition and can fit under the taxonomy framework as possible. Because I mean, we have taken the first step. We have already adopted the first so-called climate delegated act, but obviously there are some activities that are still very important for transition and which we have not yet been able to analyze and cover properly. So we really are working full speed on those, and there will be some proposals that the Commission will be making, and we are working really day and night on those, including the energy sector. So again, we also have to see, and I mentioned the conditions for the transitional activities that are relatively tough in the taxonomy regulation, but we need to see basically to what extent some of these activities are meeting those conditions, and if not, whether we need to recognize those activities that are very important for transition, including in the energy sector, by other means. So this is basically kind of the debate that I think we are going to have in Europe. Another debate that we are going to have, and where I really would like to encourage all stakeholders who are interested, is to contribute to the debate that the platform has launched now on the possible merits of extension of the taxonomy framework to cater for activities that have intermediate performance level. So there again, the platform will finalize the work basically in coming weeks, but after that, it's for the Commission to interact with stakeholders and to draw our own conclusions and recommendations to the co-legislators, because as I said, we will have to be pretty quick already before the end of the year. Then I mentioned, the work that we will really now start on the different labels and transition standards and possible other products or tools. We really would like to hear from the sector what you think actually would be useful. We don't want to come up with something that we think it's important, but we do need more input from you. I mean, where you think a possible action, not necessarily regulatory action, would be handy. And I have to say that this transition is a concept that is really evolving enormously. I think that the report that the platform presented in spring was already very rich, but it was just the first step. And the more I observe, and obviously I also actively contribute to the agenda, this agenda will really evolve a lot. And we need, everybody, who cares about how the feasibility of implementing these goals to contribute to the best thinking that we have. So, Sean, thank you very much for inviting me. It was a great pleasure to talk to you as always. And I wish all stakeholders a very nice rest of the conference.
It's been a privilege to work with you. It will be a privilege to continue to work with you, Martin, as we achieve this incredible transition that we're working on, all of us in Europe and globally. So thank you, everyone, for listening. For my friend Martin, who's the head of the Sustainable Finance Unit at DG FISMA in the European Commission. And now we're going to cut to a session on a core area of the industrial transition, hydrogen and green hydrogen. and the opportunity for it to be a turnkey in so many other industries. So stay with us. Thanks again, Martin.
Thank you.